Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. The authoritarian right loves to talk about how they're upholding democracy. Trump didn't lose the 2020 election because if he had, democracy would have been against him. So instead it was stolen from him, his loss a subversion of the democratic process. Now, as a deeply unpopular second-term president, he and his loyalists pretend they are executing the will of the people, instead of horrifying most Americans while circumventing the people's elected legislature. My guest today has written a terrific book, The Reactionary Spirit, about this odd contradiction in contemporary autocratic rhetoric. On the one hand, far-right anti-democratic regimes speak in the language of democracy and popular will. On the other, they are, anti-democratic regimes. Zach Beecham is a senior correspondent at Vox, where he covers challenges to democracy in the United States and abroad, right-wing populism, and the world of ideas. Reimagining Liberty is a listener-supported show. If you'd like to listen to episodes uninterrupted by ads from our sponsors, you can become a supporter. You'll get my newsletter ad-free as well. To learn more, head to www.reimaginingliberty.com. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Zach. One of the things that's striking in the way that Trump and Trumpists and kind of the whole MAGA movement talks is, on the one hand, this is, I think, very clearly an authoritarian movement or a movement towards establishing authoritarianism, whether they end up successful in that or not. But on the other hand, they talk a ton in the language of democracy. Trump spends a lot of time talking about how large his victories have been, even though they haven't been large, in inflating them. Especially in the early days of the administration, there was a lot of talk of this is just the will of the people. The people decided, and everything we're doing is what they decided because we won this election by a handful of votes, which seems different from the way that when we think about historical authoritarians, historical autocrats, they don't tend to say I'm democratic. What's going on there?
Yeah, I think that this points to something really deep and partly motivated me to write the book, right, is that for all the talk about, democratic backsliding, a global democratic recession, all that's, debatably true. It depends on what you're talking about. In some cases, undoubtedly true. But it masks a very deep way in which democracy has won, right? And still is winning. And by winning, I mean shaping the way in which we talk and think about politics, right? Because prior to World War II, democracy was one of several, liberal democracy specifically, was one of several different competing political theories or notions of what gave a government legitimacy, right? There were a variety of different reactionary, monarchical, or Christian views about where authority comes from, namely God or the church, or both. There were fascist ideas, there were communist ideas, all of which had very different theories of political legitimacy and of the state that structured the way that their leaders talked about politics, right? Instead of appealing to the will of the people as constituted through elections, they would appeal to the people, the sort of grand sense of the nation as a unity or an organic whole in fascist rhetoric, or in communist rhetoric, it was to the proletariat and the sort of the forces of history, different vocabularies, right? And over the course of the past 80 years or so, but especially after the end of the Cold War, those competitions have been resolved in liberal democracy's failure, right? This, really started in the construction of the post-World War II order, the creation of things like the UN Charter of Human Rights, which contains, democracy or the right to democratic representation and self-rule as an explicit guarantee that people are deserved. And over the course of time, it became sovereignty, popular sovereignty, and self-determination, free speech. These ideas that are embedded in democracy, and again, liberal democracy specifically, I think the two are harder to disentangle than some people might say they are. Um, they just became the assumed dominant language of global politics. And no one has been able to overturn it since then. And in fact, most modern authoritarians don't even try. China has pushed on this probably the most, but it's a really minor part of China's influence operation, right? And it's not a very successful one, right? Where there used to be, even during the Cold War, popular communist parties operating in advanced democratic states that could do quite well in elections at times, right? There was never any modern country in which a "we want to be China" government has won, any modern democracy that is, where "we want to be China" party has won an election. That's not happened. In fact, there are almost no parties that I can think of that have won meaningful vote shares that promise something like that. Openly avowing authoritarianism is just not a way to win power in a democracy, and certainly nothing like the way that, the Nazi Party rose to power with significant popular support. That's almost unthinkable today to happen in the exact same way.
You mentioned the disentangling of democracy and liberal democracy. And that strikes me as interesting in this regard because on the one hand, you're right, we don't see Trump or Vance or others in the MAGA movement talking about themselves being anti-democratic. They quite the opposite. But on the other hand, they are openly and explicitly hostile to liberalism. The intellectualized side of MAGA, whether that's like the Vancian version or the Vermeulen Deneen integralist version or the Curtis Yarvin neo-reactionary version, their arguments are all, there's something about liberalism itself that has failed. We are where we are and we need to break things or remake things because liberalism has failed. So they seem to be disentangling. Like, on the one hand, we're pro-democratic, at least in our rhetoric. On the other hand, we are basically anti-liberal.
Yeah. So this is another thing I looked at in the book, specifically in the long arc of American politics, because the U.S. is the country that has had the longest sort of period of ideological democratic dominance of anywhere in the world. So it's really interesting to track the ebbs and the flows across American history of how different factions argued about this. Because while I think that liberalism and democracy are tied at the hip, there's still real tension between them in certain cases. I don't think I need to explain things like the counter-majoritarian dilemma to your listeners. But that tension can be exploited by people who are opposed to both liberal and democracy by claiming to stand for one half of the equation while really actually opposing both. So to me, the quintessential example of this phenomenon happening in early American history is the way that John C. Calhoun, who's the foremost theorist of the slave South, right, and still widely regarded by some as a pioneering political theorist, despite all of it being in service of slavery and upholding slavery, right? Calhoun took the reverse position. His argument was, if we allow democracy to operate unchecked, what it will do is come for the liberties of the Southern people, namely specifically the liberties to own slave. He talks quite a lot about how the climate of free speech in the North is enabling the rise of abolitionist rhetoric, and there's nothing that can be done about that. They're not going to lose. They will win a numerical majority. And as a result of that, the South needs to enshrine a system that protects its own political rights. He's often more abstract, but he really is mostly talking about slavery. Through the national government, the ancient, unalterable, God-given liberties, right? Is the kind of language that he used. So that's weaponizing liberalism against democracy, again, in service of a position that is neither liberal nor democratic. The idea that you should be able to hold a huge chunk of the population in bondage in perpetuity violates basic principles of both liberalism and democracy. Over time, the valence of liberalism and democracy, which concept is more popular among reactionary cohorts, has flipped, right? So contemporary rightists do the inverse of that. Now, Yarvin, who you mentioned, is an exception. He's just an outright anti-democrat, right? He thinks democracy is bad, trains aspire on democracy. He also could never win an election. He would, even in a Republican primary, he would get destroyed in part because he's a very weird man, but also because that argument has no purchase. But now, right, in the current political climate, saying that what we are standing for is a democracy that's being trampled on by an undemocratic liberalism, a sort of a politics of the cultural elite that wants to impose its values on the median American who doesn't share their view of the world. That kind of argument has worked not just in the US, but in a variety of different other democracies in different contexts, right? They use sort of different arguments as to why the cultural elite is trying to do these things through their liberal machinations. But it is the structure of the argument is the same. It's just inverted Calhounism. They want to destroy democracy. They want to enshrine themselves in power. And you can see that not through their rhetoric, but through the actual policies that they implement, which do significant damage to the foundations of a democratic society. But the weapon that they use to enshrine this anti-democratic position is democracy itself. It's turning the concept of democracy against itself, and specifically against the liberal components of a liberal democratic society.
Is this why so much of the talk seems to be about essentially who's the actual electorate? Or who are the people who count in a democracy? That it is, I think the clearest, kind of most explicit example of this is like Elon Musk playing up the Great Replacement theory, which is there is a polity, there's a democratic polity. It is native born, white. It is the kinds of people Elon Musk likes, and that what's actually happening behind the scenes is all of these people, the Democrats and liberals, are importing like a false democratic polity into the country in order to subvert the will of the true people. Or you see this, I think, with the schools, universities and schools are corrupting the polity, so it no longer represents the will of the real people or the real people's real will, but is instead, or Trump, just the election was stolen. Like if in 2020 I would have won, the people chose me, but it was stolen. That it seems to be you can get rid of liberalism by just defining out the people who hold views you dislike as not authentically part of the democratic polis. And then if we just limit ourselves to the democratic polis, then of course they're going to choose what we would want.
Yeah, I mean, the text here, and I don't think this is being used as a guidebook, but rather it's just brilliant as a concept, even if dark, and one that illuminates the structure of this kind of argument, is Carl Schmitt's work in the Interwar Years. Right. So Schmitt is famous for his argument that politics is about defining friends and enemies. Right. And so you can see the obvious applicability to that. But I think what's underappreciated in Schmitt's argument, and what helps me, at least reading Schmitt, see more clearly the structure of modern reactionary discourse, is that Schmitt argued that this was essential to establishing what he understood to be true democracy. By this, I mean the friend-enemy distinction in the following way, right? So Schmitt believed that no democracy could be universally inclusive, right? That and to be fair, there are really real tensions about the limits of democratic inclusion, when somebody can become a citizen, when they should get a voice. Should a globe-spanning empire like the United States give foreigners some say in its foreign policy, given how important it is for them? All sort of edge cases, right, in democratic political theory. But Schmitt didn't treat them as edge cases, as sort of tests of a general principle. Right? For him, this was proof that democracy ultimately depended on defining a certain group of people as the democratic polity. And that definition, the friend, right, could be based in any kind of antagonism, any kind of separateness. He actually doesn't really care. It ended up in Germany being anti-Semitism, which was convenient to Schmitt because he was a lifelong and deeply committed anti-Semite. But he says explicitly, right, what matters is that the polity and the sovereign specifically, right, decides who the people are, and then carves out everybody else as not necessarily to be a group to be exterminated, but a group that could potentially become a legitimate object of war. That's the distinction between friend and enemy for Schmitt, right? And in the United States, what is happening right now is that liberalism and liberals have been defined as the enemy. Right there, and by the enemy, they mean like in Schmittian terms, not that the people on the sort of Trumpy right want to exterminate liberals today, but they do not see themselves as sharing a country, right? They see themselves as locked in an existential war, political war, over the same territory, and ultimately one side has to win and the other side has to lose, right? I read an essay by Adrian Vermeil today, right, who it's from about a year ago, who says very explicitly, this is what I think politics is. And I think that all the liberals are deluding themselves. In fact, I believe that they're deluding themselves so much that they've lost the debate over this being how politics works. He's wrong about that, I think. But I brought up the essay only to underscore how relevant this is to the theorists who most clearly see the heart of the Trump project. Because Vermeil is a very smart man, even if he has a sort of, his politics are extraordinarily extreme. He understands what the stakes of this debate are, right? And for him, it really does come down to an existential Schmittian conflict between two groups who have mutually incompatible views of who the polity is and what values should dominate and what types of people should get to wield power. And that maneuver, that notion, now is being tied up in democratic language. Trump doesn't do that in this highfalutin manner, right? He just says like the votes were stolen, they made them up, it's fraud, whatever. But someone like J.D. Vance does, someone like Elon Musk does, right? In the way that they talk, not so much endorsing the craziest things that Trump says about rigged election machines and stuff like that, though it wouldn't surprise me if Musk had done that at one point. But rather talking about things that, as you mentioned, like the Great Replacement, that define out, provide a sort of scaffolding for defining out people from the population to be able to lay claim to the mantle of true American in this existential war that they believe exists between two different elite factions.
Why now, then? I mean, as your book traces the history of reactionary thought in America, and it goes rather far back in the country's history, and you can always find in every society, there's always an element of people who don't like the direction the culture is headed, when the culture is becoming more liberal, becoming more tolerant, and particularly when liberal tolerance or just dynamism, like this is a critique of like free market economies, as they create cultural dynamism as well. When that dynamism starts to dissolve the hierarchies these people are either at the top of or at least comfortable within. That's a universal human experience. Those people have always existed. We have the data on kind of authoritarian personality types, that there's some number of people who kind of this fits their psychological worldview. But at the same time, they always seem like a relatively small number. Like most Americans do not want to exclude whole races of people. They don't want to drive LGBT people back into the closet. Most of them are fairly happy with kind of the state of the culture. So why are we seeing this now? What has changed to empower this particular version of the reactionary spirit to success, if at some level none of this is new and the stuff they're reacting to is not new?
So the way that I think about this is that anti-democratic politics of the sort that I'm describing, right? There's many kinds of anti-democratic politics on the left, right, and even the center in certain ways, right? And we can talk about different reasons why each of them is differentially successful at different times, right? But I'm talking about a specific strain of right-wing anti-democratic politics that I've termed reactionary. And what I mean by that is a kind of politics that says social progress or economic progress or some sort of change, progress meaning a change to the current distribution of power and resources to favor previously disfavored groups. That change has gone so far that we blame the democratic system for it, right? For enabling this kind of change, and that democracy needs to be dismantled or at least rolled back to some degree as a result. So why is this flaring up around the world now? right? Because it's not just an American phenomenon, right? There are a number of different countries. The examples I use in the book are India, Hungary, and Israel, where there have been similar kinds of politics that have found significant success, all quite different, right? Each of those countries has very distinct histories, social structures, etc. But the style of politics is eerily similar as practiced by their currently ruling governments. So it's because of the same macro phenomenon that I was describing earlier, right? Which is the legacy of the end of the 20th century, which is one in which democracy triumphed, but democracy triumphed in a particular way, right? It triumphed alongside what I take to be the core democratic principle, which is an idea of equal citizenship, that everybody who lives inside of a polity, right, deserves to be treated as if not a full social equal, then a political equal, that no one person deserves by virtue of their standing or their birthright to dominate others in the political realm, to have more votes than they are, to be able to shut off their ability to choose their political representation entirely, etc. This idea, which really I take to be the core moral content of democracy, without which democracy does not make normative sense, also won the 20th century. Right. And it won because it manifested not just in terms of there being elections in a lot more countries, but because many, many more countries took steps to move towards this vision of social equality. Right. Now, some of it was the creation of mechanisms for the redistribution of wealth, right, to deal with extreme inequalities. Part of it was the assault on racial or religious hierarchies, right? So something like the civil rights movement in the United States, the formal abolition of caste discrimination in India, or the 1990s era peace process between the Israelis and Palestinians. Other examples obviously include, range from different areas, gender, sexuality, etc. Right? All of this happened in a remarkably short period of time. The amount of changes in an egalitarian direction that happened between 1945 and 2000, let's just say arbitrarily, is unprecedented in human history. Nothing like this has ever happened before. And a lot of people found that profoundly upsetting. Right. And we can weigh whether their reasons are good or not. But I think it's worth bracketing whether any of those reasons even could be good to establish that that is the motivating factor at work here. And it doesn't take a majority, as you suggested, right? Like most Americans don't want to roll back same-sex marriage. Obergefell, the decision to establish same-sex marriage. But political structures can enable minorities who have feelings like this to wield disproportionate amounts of power. And in the US case specifically, what happened is that we have two parties, right? And we have a primary system, and extreme polarization between the two parties. That means that whoever controls one of the major parties, if they can command a majority of ordinary voters who will turn out for a primary election, they can control the destiny of the entire country. Because you have two choices, and voters, if they're unhappy with one choice, will pick the other. Most voters don't understand the ideological stakes of what we're talking about. So when Trump took over the Republican Party and then established that he was in control of it firmly after he came back from January 6th, we were sort of off to the races in terms of reactionary politics. We don't know how far the limit is as to what kind of thing is acceptable now, because the structure gives these kinds of people, the minority of Americans who are deeply upset with the changes to our social structure over the course of the past several decades, they've extraordinary power now, and they won it democratically, right? That's not in doubt. The 2024 election was on the level, but it is now being wielded in ways that undermine the ability for the people to change their mind. And that's quite dangerous and scary.
Yeah, the example I think I've mentioned before of how rapid the pace of change is I think I came across Pew study of acceptance of interracial marriage. Do you think it's okay for members of different races to marry? And the point at which it flipped to majorities were okay with it, as opposed to majorities opposing interracial marriage, was while I was in high school. And I'm not that old, like it's So this is certainly within living memory of quite a lot of people, or the rapid acceptance. I remember the huge controversies when Ellen came out on her show, which was again in like the mid '90s, I think it was, um, and how rapid that change has happened. So yes, like there's been this rapid change, but what I wonder is it's a majority of people who reacted extremely strongly against it. And you mentioned some of the others, like the centrists. We've seen kind of this movement of reactionary centrists, I think, embodied by, like, say, some members of the New York Times opinion section, who are upset with certain aspects of how quickly this has moved. But they're not typically the ones calling for, like, the hard edge of Vancian, like, proto-fascism or whatever we want to label it. And so what I wonder is, maybe things have moved a bit too fast for some number of people and much too fast for a much smaller number of people. But most of us have acclimated fairly well to the new world and like a lot of what it has to offer. And now we're getting with Trump that the speed at which they're running through the reactionary agenda, the kind of clear attempts to resegregate the military, to, we're recording this, I think, the day after the Supreme Court is allowing them to move forward with kicking trans people out of the military, the abolition of essentially any expressions of diversity from anywhere. Like it's happening at it's an impossible to ignore pace of change and degree of change. Is whether this is essentially like a last gasp of this level of reaction, because people are going to very quickly see the kind of world we left behind. Like there's a reason that we moved towards greater acceptance, and that we didn't stick in the level of, strict social hierarchies and reactionary values. And so I guess one way of asking this is, like, if all of that is true, and if the reaction has been by a narrow margin, they won, and now they are just trying to turn back the clock in a matter of months to a world that most people are happy to have left behind, are we going to see something like wokeism 2.0? Come, like, just that, America is going to become even more accepting or socially liberal, call it, than the trend line we were on had indicated, because we're basically getting a extremely clear and very undesirable for most of us reminder of what we left behind.
So you've got like a Star Wars structure going on here, right? It's like you got A New Hope around 2020, and now we're in The Empire Strikes Back, and soon will be Return of the Woke. Look,
yes.
I don't know. And I don't know if that would even be desirable, right? There were like clearly very positive elements of the rise of social justice thinking and its integration into modern liberalism. I'm sure there were areas in which it went too far as well. I found the people who complained about that very irritating, because they would frame it in totalizing terms. The very idea of wokeness is a threat to the freedom that underpins American civilization, and liberalism has been destroyed and has been replaced by an aggressive successor ideology and stuff like that. None of that was true, right? Yep. It is true, and we see that in hindsight, right? Because were that the case, then you would be seeing this kind of really militant anti-liberal response to the Trump administration. And what's actually happening is that people are engaging in extremely democratic means of resistance. They're going to protest. They're calling their members of Congress. They're organizing groups at home. They're, posting a lot on social media, right? There's subscribing to newspapers. It's just what is happening. The reaction to Trump is entirely within confines of liberal democratic politics. That was always the problem that I had with this, like, wokeness is existential threat diagnosis. Is like, sure, there are incidents of people shutting down speech at college campuses, but that's not the same thing as wanting to impose an illiberal speech censorship regime on large swaths of the country, we now know what that looks like. right? Where we're literally seeing it happen right now. And that's just not what happened in the United States or in blue states over the course of the last 10 years or so. And I think people who advocated that position should be chastened or feel chastened. But I guess what I'm hoping for, what I believe is possible, is a rediscovery of the virtues of really, really, really basic liberal ideas. Right. If really when we talked about wokeness, what we're talking about is in part a movement that pushed the limits of liberalism, that is to force liberals to see where they had blind spots about race and gender and sexual orientation, and that those blind spots had been identified by radicals well before they were identified by liberals, which I think is true in a lot of these areas. That now what we need is not pushing the limits in that sense, but a rediscovery of what's valuable about the things that are directly under assault. Things like the rule of law, an independent judiciary, separation of powers, free speech, right? These, I think if there is to be that any energy around those issues will be tied up with what are called derisively woke concerns, right? Like, because the attacks, the targets in this anti-DEI crusade, the assault on free speech, as described, are in fact, alleged woke institutions, right? Like universities, and so on. So it's not that these are separable things, but rather that I and Jacob Levy and a few others have argued that the energies that surrounded wokeness and social justice rhetoric can be infused and connected to and deeply integrated with liberal ends, and towards liberal ends, liberal democratic ends specifically. And that's what I believe, given that the main battlefield right now is the survival of American democracy itself. That's what I believe are the direction we may be heading. And we may, if I'm right about this, and again, this is all very tentative, right? We're still in the midst of the, existential struggle over the survival of American democracy. So predicting what things look like afterwards, very difficult. But if I'm right about this, then we could be entering one of those periods where you see significant efforts at structural reform of the American government. That is what tends to happen in a world where there is widespread public concern about abuses of power, right? Or about a sort of deep social cataclysm that's caused a lot of people to suffer, which you could be seeing with Trump's tariffs. So that's like the best case scenario. I'm not sure it's going to happen, but I think that there's a chance that it might.
Yeah, I think that's my optimistic scenario too. I was thinking about, we can't go back. So let's assume that American democracy does survive. We'll talk as if that world is where we're going to end up, because the alternative is rather depressing. We can talk about that. I agree with you, but but let's treat it as the most likely by far scenario for the moment. We can't go back to the old status quo, in part because it's just in the process of being blown up and defunded and fired and kicked to the curb and shut down. And so we're going to need to rethink political alignments, institutions, just the structure of American political life. But I think you're right. Like, I think it is one thing this has done is pointed to liberalism for a lot of people in a way that has cast off a lot of the cynicism about it, and has exposed its alternatives, because we went through this period where the illiberal thinkers were kind of the edgy and intriguing people, right? Like, it is this weird, living in DC through the first Trump administration, like the illiberal guys they were saying the edgy and exciting things, whereas the liberals, what they were saying was kind of the same old stuff. They had won out. It was the same arguments. It was kind of boring. They weren't exciting to have beers with in the way that the neo-reactionaries who might say something that was titillating were. And the kind of reactionary centrists were able to play up a lot of the anti-wokenism, I think, in often very dishonest ways to to push back on. I mean, a lot of it was just status anxiety, I think, for kind of centrist elites who didn't like having their views challenged and blamed the kids for it. But one thing that's happened in the last, I keep on reminding myself, it's only been 100 and some odd days. It's crazy how much has been packed in. Is a lot of masks have come off, and a lot of this has been exposed for what it was. I mean, a lot of us saw it, like knew what this was all along, and were saying it, but we were largely ignored. Um, and And so I think there's this real opportunity for kind of, a reassertion of liberal values. And I would even say, like a kind of market liberal values, because also you look at the polling data and say free trade. Like the median Democrat now looks on paper more pro-trade than Milton Friedman in terms of the polling data. Like it's just astonishing how, like we're going to see kind of what happens when markets are messed with. And so it does feel like there's this opportunity for kind of genuine social, political, and economic liberalism to be part of the conversation in that rebuilding in a way that it might not have been 10 years ago. Because again, we're seeing the value of these principles by seeing what it looks like when someone's trying to destroy them.
Yeah, I mean, the trade situation is disastrous, but I couldn't be happier about the American public waking up to this, right? I've long joked that I'm a Scandinavian liberal in the sense that I both love their welfare states and their expansive free trade policies that Bernie Sanders doesn't talk about. And so to me, this is great, right? Like, but setting that aside, right, the broader point that there's the conditions are there for a liberal flowering, right, or a liberal rebirth, I think is clearly correct. The question that I have, and I'm trying to think this through right now, honestly, like as we talk, I'm doing some reporting to try to figure out if this is already happening or this is just something that the conditions are there to happen, right? Is that a lot of people, important people, like influential thinkers and writers who had that kind of jadedness that you had are starting to realize that they were focusing on the wrong targets, that they had picked the wrong enemies. I don't want to say this as an "I told you so" because it's really tempting, right? And yeah, I'm not going to say that. What I will say instead of "I told you so" is it certainly would be nice if people who spent a lot of their time talking about the failings of liberalism or the failings of wokeness were to realize that energy would be more productively spent, not only on addressing the sort of looming threat from authoritarian right-wing politics, but also towards identifying a capacious liberalism that can accommodate anyone who might fit under the liberal tent broadly construed. That is to say, instead of trying to excommunicate various different liberals, I don't know, saying that former neoconservatives are too right-wing, or saying that college students who are protesting the war in Gaza are too left-wing or whatever, to try to say, well, liberalism is about pluralism, right? That's one of our central principles. And that means pluralism, not just on social issues to a degree, which everyone wants to say they stand up for this, but then everyone has their limits as to who gets to count inside the tent, right? And I'm trying to figure out a way to make a fully principled coalition, like stance and position on this, where people who I deeply, deeply disagree with on certain issues, ranging from Gaza to economic policy, are still broadly inside the liberal tent, and that we can figure out a way in which there are a set of not just sort of philosophical principles at the highest level, sort of Rawlsian overlapping consensus, but also real world institutions that can allow for those disagreements to play out without the threat of authoritarian intervention, and that we can all get on board with a reform package, a political reform package that can be an alternative to like Trumpian demolition derby of the government. Right, that people of good faith can say, okay, well, what we need to do is to prevent, the president from having the power to unilaterally detonate the economy and go about rooting out congressionally authorized spending seemingly illegally. Like yes, the courts are intervening later, but how do we create, but they're not stopping everything. And it's not clear how much they're going to end up stopping when the Supreme Court has its final say. So what do you do to create infrastructures that are more robust to this kind of authoritarian system? How do we protect universities from being bullied? While also keeping the federal funding dollars that are so important to ensuring America's research advantage and sort of high productivity economy by funding basic research, right? How do we keep that going without making universities constantly having an axe over their head that the next ideologically unfriendly government will drop if they want to? These are, I think, the most productive and valuable questions to be examining right now, both the high-level abstract philosophical rejiggering of liberalism and the policy stuff, because they're interrelated, right? The latter gives meat to the former, and the former gives the ideas, the intellectual structure that can inspire high-quality thinking on the latter.
I think when you're talking about building that coalition or that tent and who's in and who's out, because you do have to draw lines at some point we have to be Schmittians in our coalition building to some degree, I do think there's something to just commitment to institutions and rule of law as the common. Last week I was in the Czech Republic for a young libertarians conference and talking with European liberals. And one of them asked me why it was that it seemed like the strongest voices, or among the strongest voices against Trumpism, were not libertarians, who a lot of them are cozying up to it, are excitedly cheering on Elon Musk and Doge as it, breaks contracts and violates rule of law and in order to smash the state and fire lots of people, but is basically neocons. Like it's the bulwark folks who are shouting from the rooftops about the dangers of this stuff. And the answer that I gave, and this was a spitballed answer in the moment, but I think I'm at least partly correct, is the neocons are people who were so into American institutions and the institutions of American democracy that they enthusiastically wanted to spread those to the rest of the world with bombs. And they were wrong to want to spread them with bombs. But what it's meant is that when Trump came along and as an attack on the institutions and the rule of law, that commitment made them not susceptible to getting on board with this in a way that others who had less of a commitment to the institutions were kind of willing to overlook the institutional destruction and the abridgments of the rule of law in favor of it. And I think there's something to just that being like the bright line is it's not necessarily a commitment to like an end state of, I want a certain set of policies, but like right now it is liberalism has to be built around the rule of law and the institutions that uphold it. And if you oppose those or admire the destruction of them, then no matter what your kind of social views are or your economic policy views are, you're outside of that liberal coalition.
I mean, that seems clearly correct to me, right? These are the battle lines, right? First of all, your analysis of the neocons is correct. Though one interesting complication is that the Claremont crew, which, the Claremont Institute, founded around the ideas of Henry Jaffa, was like really about venerating American history and the American founding and then the idea of America itself. And Claremont has become the hub of, burn it all down, pro-Trump conservatism, and has been for nearly a decade at this point. So there's a question, I mean, to me, I've described that a little bit in terms of, the person who is let down by the thing that they loved the most, right? They feel like when liberalism was successful through American institutions, that made them feel so betrayed, they were willing to destroy the institutions that they had committed themselves to. Why and how that neocons did not have the same approach? We could probably talk about that. But that's a whole conversation in and of itself, as are the splits inside the libertarian movement, which you would know better than I would, but I suspect it maps, roughly onto Rothbardian versus Hayekian lines in terms of like with the Rothbardians being Trumpists and the Hayekians being much more skeptical of the sort of Trump effort to reorder American society through the state. And what that means is that, like those two examples, in the context of your broader point, is that we need to start looking to seams within broader labels that we've started to take for granted as normal blocks. Right. There even are a handful of pro-Trump neocons, right? They're there because they like Trump's position on Israel, right? And or position on Israel and related issues, I should say more broadly. They like that he takes an aggressive stance on the Middle East. And that's their top priority, right? That really motivated their neoconservatism. Um, so you look for seams in these movements and you try to figure out, not by saying, we accept all libertarians and all libertarians, but we say we accept people of any ideological denomination who believe firmly in a core set of principles about what makes a society free, equal, and fair. Right. And that's at a very high level. Right. And that's what I'm suggesting. I don't know what that translates to in terms of actual political organizing, right? How you go about going to ordinary voters and saying, are you, the good institutionalist kind of conservative or the bad Claremont kind? So that is not going to scan in the way that politicians talk to voters. But for people who are thinking about broad strokes political strategy, looking to these differences inside different subpopulations, not in the traditional demographic sense, but in the ideological sense, I think can be really valuable.
So we got off on this direction by bracketing for a moment the question of whether Trump succeeds in destroying American democracy, because all of this is everything we just talked about is basically moot if he wins out and we don't have free and fair elections in next year or in 2028. We descend into competitive authoritarianism or some other nightmare scenario. But you recently published a piece with Vox offering kind of a semi-optimistic take after the first 100 days. So can you just talk about that? Like, do you think he's going to win, or do you have reasons to think he's not winning right now?
Yeah, no, I don't think he will win. And yes, I think there are good reasons to believe that now. Again, tentative judgments, a lot of things can change over the course of the next 4 years. I don't want to be down here and then quoted in the future saying, not only is Trump losing, but he is losing irrevocably and nothing can be done to rescue his presidency. I don't think that's true. Or his project, I should say more specifically, his project to destroy American democracy. What I can say is that there are a number of different problems in the way that things are going right now that are very evident, and there are very obvious reasons for those problems that suggest that continued failure is more likely than righting the ship. So what are the problems? Right? Well, they keep stepping on legal rakes, right? They will try to do something, and then the brief that is filed for it or the letter that's sent about it is utterly incompetent and or more poorly thought out, or just simply they didn't really care about following the law. And then a judge will smack them down about this. I went through a database of court cases, right? And there were about 255 cases that I could track. Most of them had not been decided. About 33, there had been some issue in Trump's favor, right? Some ruling in Trump's favor, be it temporary or permanent. And then there were, by my count, and I double checked it with the New York Times count, about 108 different cases where Trump had been ruled against. That's losing at a little bit less than a 4-1 margin, which is not a sign that you're doing a great job turning your policies into law. And I should add as a caveat, because it's a question with this administration, are they following those rulings? And the answer is mostly yes, right? Like there are some cases where they're trying to get around having to implement what the court is doing. They're lying about it, dissembling, whether they're following or whatever. The famous case of Abrego Garcia is a really clear one where the court's getting increasingly angry at the administration. But on the whole, when the courts tell them to do something, they do it. Right. And so the judiciary is working as intended as a bulwark in the favor of democracy. And a lot of the initial signs that suggested they might be winning, not just getting these policies through that are now being overturned in the courts, also involved a lot of sort of society-wide capitulation. Media organizations were preemptively trying to settle cases with Trump, and you had universities and law firms trying to make deals with him. And the tide has really turned on all of those issues, right? People, either they're not as afraid of Trump as they used to be, or they're realizing through cases like Colombia that they're in a Lando Calrissian and Darth Vader situation, only that unlike Lando, they have a much better chance to resist, right? Because there aren't a lot of stormtroopers. Trump has not been able to marshal the stormtroopers, I should say, to be able to force people to do things. So you're seeing these formations of compacts amongst universities to do kind of strategize together, or in one case, even like create what was described as a NATO for law firms, or sorry, for universities. So if one of them, this is in the Big Ten, right? So if one Big Ten school, it comes under Trump's attack, all of the other Big Ten schools under this agreement, which has been ratified by, I believe, a majority of faculty bodies in the Big Ten, will have to come and defend each other, right? Provide legal support and funding to make sure that none of them are under attack. This is wild, right? This is advanced levels of civic resistance to creeping authoritarianism. And it's happened within 100 days, right? While Trump was, for at least some chunk of that, doing relatively well in the polls, right? And seemed like he was powerful. But his standing with the public has just completely plummeted, right? And it, as far as we can tell, it keeps getting worse. And this, I mean, one of the key inflection points has to be the tariffs, right? Because then people started to see evidence of stock market chaos and real world problems. And I suspect that'll get worse over the course of the year rather than better. Trump's approval ratings are in the tank. You're seeing significant amounts of protest activity. Republican pollsters are warning of huge problems. Like, it's all of which points to a society whose antibodies are activated, right? Who's not just like letting authoritarianism be done to them. Right, the classic case of this is Hungary, where Viktor Orban managed to fairly effectively and quickly create and consolidate a competitive authoritarian regime. And he did it primarily by doing it quietly, right, by making it very difficult to follow what was actually happening. Whereas the Trump administration has done all of this out in the open in the most blatant possible way, right? It's like you're worried about them becoming an authoritarian while they're shipping people off to actual Salvadoran gulags, right? Like, what more dramatization of the end point and the dangers of this administration could you ask for if you're the opposition? Oh, you're worried about this guy wielding unaccountable power to hurt Americans? Well, let's put insane tariffs on countries around the world based on a made-up formula that would likely trigger, if implemented, a depression, right? Literally, Trump apparently backed off the first extreme tariffs, even though the fairly extreme tariffs are still in place. The sort of second ones are still pretty bad, because he was warned it would cause an actual depression, right? And no joke depression. These kinds of things, right? It flows from the nature of the Trump regime isn't the right word, party isn't the right word, maybe the Trump movement, right? The very structure of it, from the guy at the top of it. It all follows from his own lack of follow-through, lack of commitment to consistent political principles other than getting Trump more power, his lack of attention to detail, his inability to attract high-quality talent. Right, we've got the D list of authoritarians trying to do these things based on the whims of a man who may very well be in cognitive decline, and clearly has difficulty processing information properly. And that's just not a recipe for a successful assault on democracy, especially a democracy that's as deeply entrenched as the United States is. Again, that's not to say it's inevitably going to fail. You can make counter arguments as to areas where they've succeeded, and it certainly is an argument for complacency, right? This all hinges on Trump's incompetence galvanizing a social backlash significant enough to be able to stop him from doing things. But the fact that things have gone so poorly already in the first 100 days is a real sign that there's a deep rot, and a deep rot that begins with the president, which makes it extremely difficult to fix.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Reimagining Liberty. If you'd like to listen to future episodes free of ads and sponsorships, you can become a supporter for just a few dollars a month. Head to www.aaronrosspowell.com to learn more.